Welcome back to Gary's in the Shed. I'm sure you've figured out by now a lot's been happening in my life lately. And today I thought I'd share with you the most important parts of actually what's happened. And it's all good news. You see, I've never been a particularly religious person. In fact, for a very long time, I took the fashionable cop-out of describing myself as agnostic, as a lot of people do. Not through any anti-religious feeling, because I'd always felt there was a higher power above me. But I guess like a lot of people, I was just unsure who or what that power might be. But sadly, I never really bothered to find out. Then in late 2024, around the time of the onset of illness, something made me wanted to start reading the Bible. And of course, as I worked my way through the Old Testament, I was starting to wonder about some very big ideas, things like meaning and purpose in life, and how did we get here? I wanted to understand, and not just from a biblical point of view. That's when I started doing a lot of research. What followed was months of study, lots of reading, all kinds of science books, books by atheists, books by Christians, including the work of Professor Stephen C. Meyer, with a PhD from Cambridge in the philosophy of science. Professor Meyer's work, especially this remarkable book, Signature in the Cell, helped me understand some important pieces in this story. All part of my search, I guess, for some kind of validation of faith. Slowly, I started putting the pieces together with the very first words of the book of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Not a bad start, eh? So I started my study of how the universe began. How did this all get started? It was clear to me the biblical story of creation, but how did that measure up against science in understanding how the universe began? So here's what I found. It was a real shock for me. I hope you find it interesting. For generations, science had been comfortable with the notion that the universe was eternal, with no beginning and no end. Then, in the early 1970s, a consensus emerged that the universe did in fact have a beginning with what we know as the Big Bang. This created a problem for science, especially the atheist scientists, some of whom I had encountered on my journey through the research. They believed there was a beginning, but even now, 50 years later, they can't say how it happened. In the moments before the Big Bang, 14 billion years ago, and of course through the eternity before that moment, there was no space, no energy, no time, no matter, nothing material at all. Yet suddenly, something beyond the physical, something above material, pushed the universe into existence. Now, I'm certain the universe could not have done that on its own. How do I know? Because the universe did not exist. There was nothing. Nothing except something that had always been there, something truly eternal. Now, after all the research in cosmology and theoretical physics, nobody, including the most committed atheists, have an explanation for what happened. They all say, we just don't know. Actually, some have offered their own version of what might have happened, but it's so strange, I'll save it for later. There's no doubt, however, at the moment of the Big Bang and the countless millennia after, an intelligent force had carefully planned events and prepared every possible variable to deliver a perfect universe. Through this non-physical power, the greatest conflagration of all time and the birth of the universe, first with the arrival of energy, then particles, then matter, stars and galaxies, ever expanding, all at unimaginable force, still going and accelerating today and beyond. Not some random accident, but a deliberate action powered and directed with staggering precision by a powerful intelligence. There were so many variables necessary to make that happen. Most I don't understand, but some are familiar, like velocity, expansion rate, magnetism, temperature, density, gravity, each of them set at precisely the right levels, and each of them perfectly in synchronization with one another. If any one of those settings was off by even the tiniest fraction, there would be no universe, and there would be no us. The experts call this control of all the variables fine-tuning, a guiding hand only possible with precise input from a conscious mind. If, for example, gravity were out of tune by even a millionth of a degree, the universe would have either blown out into fiery dust or imploded back into nothingness from where it came. The probability of this alignment happening so perfectly by chance, as many scientists still believe, have been calculated at 10 to the power of 90. That's the number 1 followed by 90 zeros. I have heard a leading mathematician say, if you said those odds were impossible, you would be forgiven. It was no accident. It was the work of a divine, eternal intelligence. Now, let's fast forward about 10 billion years for the first signs of life. And here, there is a rising tide of evidence that is shifting this debate. Traditionally, it was assumed that life randomly popped into being in a pond somewhere. No real explanation, just trust us. It happened 4 or 5 billion years ago, just a very simple cell. But now we understand there is no such thing as a simple cell. The newest evidence in biochemistry makes it clear that some unregulated, accidental, undirected, random process could not possibly account for the miracle of a living cell. It's like a microscopic factory in there, working overtime, with all kinds of functions like fault spotting, repair work, cleaning, garbage disposal, and transportation of elements around the cell. It's mind-boggling. Sadly, it's not possible yet to actually record these machines in action. They are smaller than the wavelength of light. Check this out. A great example, this is the flagellum, a nanotechnology machine using a whip-like tail to propel cells through fluids, just like the outboard motor on a boat. This rotary engine, with components like bushings and bearings and drive shaft, spins at 100,000 revs per minute. It stops in a quarter turn and then speeds off in reverse. It's amazing. But the real stars of the show are those taking care of the most important molecule in life, the DNA. Using computer animation based on molecular research, we're now able to see how DNA is copied inside living cells. You're looking at an assembly line of machines that are pulling apart the DNA double helix, cranking out a copy of each strand. The whirling blue machine there is spinning at the speed of a jet engine as it unwinds the double helix into 2 strands, ready for the creation of 2 identical DNA molecules. And each strand, remember, is 200,000 times thinner than a human hair. Inside each cell, by the way, your body has at least 30 trillion cells, The DNA and the genetic code that it carries is a set of instructions for the creation of life. So this is a model of the DNA molecule. It was discovered by two scientists, James Watson and Francis Crick, in 1953. But the most important discovery was not revealed until about 4 years later, when Crick looked inside the double helix and he found this: 4 alphabetic characters, C, A, G, and T. That mix combines to create the longest word ever made, with 3.5 billion pairs of letters, creating the source code of life. Now, you might find this difficult to believe, but inside your body, the DNA strands we saw in the video before will reach 18 billion kilometres. That's right, 1.8 metres inside the tiny nucleus of every cell. Now, the reason I've been sharing all this level of detail with you is to demonstrate the amazing scale and complexity of it all. And do you know what? I'm only skimming the surface of this. Now, given all that, how could all this happen through some kind of random trial and error? I'm now convinced it's not possible. The DNA sequence that instructs the cell is not digital or mechanical. It is the information made up by those 4 characters, G, A, C, and T, providing information for the manufacture of proteins, giving life to the cell. Now, the key word there is information, because information originates from a conscious mind. This is critical to the whole conversation. This is language, information, and as such, it needs a mind. Like all information, whether it's on a printed page, whether it's on a menu, or carved into a rock wall, or it's graffiti on a fence, it all comes from a conscious being. Now, Bill Gates said this is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software ever created. Now, I can understand me saying that because of the complexity of what's going on here. The traditional science position relies heavily on Charles Darwin and his masterwork on the origin of species, published in 1859. This laid out the theory of evolution and had remained unchallenged for over 100 years. Now, interestingly, Darwin actually never addressed the origin of any species, as suggested by the title of the book. He studied the incremental evolutionary changes over time to species that already existed. His research had nothing to do with the beginning of life at all. Just 7 years after the publication of his groundbreaking book, Darwin said, "Though I expect at some future time the origin of life will be rendered intelligible, at present it seems to me beyond the confines of science." That's an interesting way of sort of retreating from his previous position, it seems. The living cell is described as irreducibly complex. In other words, with multiple interacting parts, all those tiny little machines working together, the removal of any one part would kill the cell. Everything works together and cannot be reduced, hence irreducibly complex. So how could such a complex thing evolve step by step over time? It seems so unlikely as to be almost impossible. But the modern establishment still insists that the whole thing is just a great big accident, purely random and no plan behind it at all. Now, probably the most vocal atheist on this subject is Richard Dawkins, the Oxford biologist, who said, wait for it, "The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference." So you can see how vocal they become to fight against the idea of intelligent design. For some of the atheists, I think their problem seems to be a reluctance to even consider a higher authority, unable to even whisper the G word. Even Richard Dawkins himself conceded that the information in DNA might be the signature of some kind of designer. I thought, wow, that's exciting. But then, of course, he immediately sidetracked into something about alien civilizations or something. And a lot of people actually believe it, that this came from outer space. And finally, a word from my favourite scientist, Sir Isaac Newton. He's the apple falling on the head guy, who published what many say is the most important scientific paper of all time, back in 1687, on the laws of gravity and motion. That's over 330 years ago. Anyway, this paper is quoted many, many times in science today and is still in use. Newton, in a perfect 8-character formula, enabled the prediction of the movements of all the planets and the sun and the comets across the solar system. Those same laws are used today. And although he never explained what gravity actually is, he could prove that gravity determined the locations and the orbits of the planets, something that the planets could not have done themselves. Very interesting. He's a well-known Christian believer, but still recognised as one of the greatest scientists of all time. In describing the solar system, Newton said, "This most beautiful system, the sun and the planets and the comets, could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being." Newton then went on to say, "What a clever God did that." So that's the story of Sir Isaac Newton. Now, in summary, just 3 important points to remember for both the birth of the universe and the origin of life. The material universe had a beginning. It's acknowledged. It's the Big Bang, and nobody contests it. Science, meanwhile, can't explain it. And point 3, there is compelling evidence of an intelligent designer for both the birth of the universe and the beginning of life. 10 billion years apart, those 2 moments. Now, earlier I did promise to share with you the atheist alternative to intelligent design. Here it is. It's called the multiverse. Now, in this theory, there is not one world, the one we know and love. There are infinite worlds, and we just lucked out to be on this one. Well, it's very weird, and it's quite easily challenged, because we can simply ask, okay, if that's true, who created your infinite worlds? For generations, you see, scientists had assumed an eternal world and liked to challenge the Christians. So, who created God? Now we answer, no one created our God, he's eternal. So who do you think created the universe? It's a very simple conversation now. Because unlike the early scientists like Darwin, like Newton, we know a lot more about both the universe and the beginnings of life. And so I believe in an intelligent designer. So who or what might that be? Unlike many scientists, I'm no longer afraid of the G word. For me, it is God. And now, everywhere I look, I see evidence of fine-tuning. And I see evidence everywhere of intelligent design. Now, everywhere I look, I see evidence of God. I want to thank you for sticking with me through this quite long and complicated conversation, but I thought it was an important thing to do. Now, some of it was quite complicated, just like life itself, and I never imagined I would ever dig this deeply into this subject. But equally, I couldn't think of anything more important.